Okay, welcome everybody to our annual New Year's Day class. Today, I think we're going to talk about something very interesting, kind of in line of what we've been doing the past few times. Not last time when we spoke about Christmas, and not Thanksgiving when we usually speak about Thanksgiving sermons, but the general problem that Jews have faced when they first come to America. So in the past, we've spoken about familial problems, specifically with Aguna, in line with what we learned on Wednesday night. Last time, after my kids got sick and tired of hearing about Aguna, we talked about Shechita and problems of kashrus. That's something we'll probably return to. The Jews faced when they came to America. And today we'll talk about Shabbos and the Chil Shabbos, the violation of Shabbos that occurred as Jews came to America. So I'd just like to dedicate class today to, in memory of my great uncle Leibish, Yehuda Aryeh Leib, whose yard site is this coming Thursday, the 23rd of Teves, which is January 7th. My great uncle and my grandfather were survivors of the war. They escaped the Budzin labor camp and were partisans in the forest for 2 years. And so I'd like to dedicate here in his memory. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see the sources on Zoom. If there are any Zoom problems, my kids are here. Hopefully we'll be able to figure them out. So let's start at the beginning. We have a very interesting responsa to study today, and the responsa is from Rav Chaim Berlin. So Rav Chaim Berlin, as you can see on the sources, is the firstborn son of the Nitziv and Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, who is the famed Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin. The Nitziv's second son, of course, was Rav Meir Bar Ilan. Rav Chaim Berlin was born in 1832. He was rabbi in Moscow, then eventually came to the yeshiva to Volozhin. For those who are familiar with the history of Volozhin, so there was some controversy. But eventually he went and became rabbi in a number of other places that you can see listed there in the sources. He then moved to Yerushalayim, where he was helping with Shmuel Salant, and died in Yerushalayim in 1912. Of course, here in the New York area, so there's Yeshivas Rav Chaim Berlin is of course named after Nitziv's son, after Rav Chaim Berlin. So the question that he addresses is as follows, looking further on the sources, and this is found in his set of response called Nishmas Chaim, Asher Sha'al B'mi she'ein banav nohagim kishura b'Amerika. Okay, so somebody, it's not clear who, but somebody wrote to Rav Chaim Berlin and told him about his situation, which was that he has at least two sons, a couple of sons, who are living in America, and they're not acting properly. Okay, what does that mean? Nonetheless, but when their father is with them, so then they're concerned. Then they want to make sure to honor their father, and they'll act properly when their father is around, but presumably they won't act properly when the father is not around. Now, it's not exactly clear where the father is, but the father is also living in America, or the father lives in Europe and goes to visit his sons. We'll just keep that in mind as we go through. It doesn't seem totally clear, but anyway, so what is it that they're doing wrong? Right? The question is closing their shops and their factories on Shabbos. Okay, if the father were to leave, then these children will open their stores in public on Shabbos. And this is obviously not a proper thing to do. So the question is, so we'll go through the words in a moment, but the question at the end of the day is, does the father have to stay there in order to ensure that his children will not open their stores on Shabbos, will not work in the factory on Shabbos, or can he leave and then his children will in fact open up their stores on Shabbos? So is he required to stay with his sons in America in order to make sure that they behave properly? Now, it goes without saying, we're talking about 10-year-old sons, right? We're talking about sons who are old enough to work in a factory and have a store and so on and so forth. Okay, that is the question that is given to Rav Chaim Berlin. It's interesting to note his formulation here. He says, right? Is the father required to be ocher she'erov v'nafsho? So what exactly does that mean? So ocher is like to cause trouble or to something of that sort. But this language comes from a pasuk in Mishli. So if you look on the left side there in the sources, I don't know if you can see the little hand here, but my cursor, but maybe you can. So yes, you can. So this is a pasuk in Mishli, Perik Yud Aleph, pasuk Yud Zayin. Gomel nafsho ish chased be'ocher she'ero achzari. So if you look in Sfaria, the translation is from JPS is a kindly man benefits himself, a cruel man makes trouble for himself. Okay, so that's what I mean. So Rashi translates not like that. Rashi says Gomel nafsho, Gomel tova lekrovav, ish shehu chased. So Rashi says Gomel nafsho means somebody who does good for his relatives. Okay, it says not he himself personally, but such a person is an ish chassid. Such a person is a kindly man. What does that mean? Rashi says, right? But someone who is cruel is also cruel to his relatives. Okay, so that's what that's how Rashi translates it, and I don't know, maybe that's what Rav Chaim Berlin means as well, right? So that the father is asking whether he has to make sure to perform kindness to his relatives, meaning his sons, make sure they don't violate Shabbos, or not. But that's not the only way to read this pasuk. Mitzudas David explains as follows. Again, on the left side here, there are the sources. Gomel nafsho, misha gomel tovlu nafsho. Someone who is good to themselves, right? Okay, so someone who's good to themselves, meaning that they take care of themselves and make sure they stay healthy. So that person is a kindly person. Because when one is kind to themselves, then that will ensure that they'll be kind to others as well. However, he goes on to say, one who is not kind to themselves, he starves himself, or he's a miser, whatever it is, someone who's not kind to themselves also will not be kind to others. Okay, so it's two different versions of reading this pasuk. Is the pasuk referring to the kindness or the cruelty that one performs to their relatives, or is it the kindness and the cruelty one performs to themselves? And if it's the second, then it could be the question of, then Rav Chaim Berlin could be pointing to, is that the father, who it seems does not want to be in America, as we'll see, and the question is, does he have to harm himself in order to save his sons? So it's not totally clear to me which version Rav Chaim Berlin is referring to, or whether he's actually referring to both. But the halachic question is straightforward. Does the father have to stay near his sons in order to ensure that they won't violate Shabbos? Okay. Any questions on that? You have to unmute yourself if you have a question. Okay, so let's go on to the beginning of his answer. And Rav Chaim Berlin has a specific view on the violation of Shabbos and those who violate Shabbos. And as we'll see later, hopefully we'll have time, this is not universal. So halacha psuka biyadenu. So now we're by the aleph and the tshuva. Halacha psuka biyadenu. It's a clear halacha. Shekol hamachal Shabbos b'fer hesya. Anyone who violates Shabbos publicly, who mumar l'chol Torah kula, v'dino ke'akum l'chol dvarav. Okay, so such a person is a rebel against the entire Torah, and he has the status of a non-Jew for everything. Okay, so that's pretty radical. So where does he get that from? So if you look on the left side here, it's Gemara and Eruvin. So Gemara and Eruvin says, Amar Rav Huna. Rav Huna says, Eze Yisrael Mumar, who is a rebellious Jew, this is someone who violates Shabbos publicly. Okay, so that's pretty clear cut, right? You can't get more clear than that. But he goes on, because of a Tashbates, and the Tashbates is right there under the Gemara on the left side, but we'll just read it in Rav Chaim Berlin. The Tashbates writes, Shalamdu zechazal miloshen hakasov, that our sages learned this directly from a pasuk. Beini uvein b'nei Yisrael usi li'olam. Right, so this is what pasuk says. We say it in Kiddush, right? That Shabbos is between the Jews and God as a sign. So what does that mean? Kol shomer Shabbos nikei Yisrael. So if you keep the sign, then you're part of the Jewish people. Mishe'eno shomer Shabbos eno mechlal Yisrael. But someone who doesn't keep the sign, someone who doesn't keep Shabbos, is not part of the Jewish people. Okay, then so that seems like a pretty clear cut halacha then. that someone who violates Shabbos, that's a bad thing to do. Such person has a status in many ways of a non-Jew, and that just hammers home the seriousness of the offense, of the potential offense of the children. Okay, he goes on to ask a number of questions exactly in terms of the rules themselves. Does this mean somebody who violates Shabbos on a biblical level? What if somebody only violates Shabbos on a rabbinic level? And so on and so forth. That's what we see in Davka Melechus Deoraisa, Afa Machalabis Rabbanan. Okay, so Nikra Mumar. And what is called public? Does public mean that everybody knows about it? Does it mean that a few people know about it? Do you need 20 people to know about it, 40 people to know about it? Okay, so those are all these, those are these, some of the questions of detail that Rav Chaim Berlin notes. Okay. At the end of the day, he gives his. Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, before you go on, is there any opinion by Rav Chaim Berlin on those who were forced to serve in the Russian army?
So I don't know. I am not in any way an expert on the Chuvas of Rav Chaim Berlin. That is actually a really good question. Maybe I should look into that for next time. But you're right. He's like right in the thick of it. He's with the rabbi of Moscow. I don't know the answer.
It's clearly not the viewpoint that was taken with soldiers that were drafted into the Russian army or the Polish army. Good.
So we're gonna see that this viewpoint is not universal at all. Though Rav Chaim Berlin certainly holds it, and he's going to hold it all the way through his responsa. But I do not know if he commented at all on this situation, like you said, the Cantonists who were taken into the Russian army. It's a good question. I'll have to look at that for next time.
The question this person is posing to him is more of where somebody has a choice, voluntary.
Yeah.
Voluntary violation of Shabbos versus being put in a situation where you may not have as easy a choice.
No, right. So certainly if the case is Shabbos or death, so we know it's when you violate Shabbos, right? But unfortunately, a lot of the Jews who were in the
I'm not saying no. I'm just saying that
violate Shabbos.
The question being asked is not one of not even life and death, but of significant struggle. He's asking it of that they have a choice. He's presenting as if his sons have a choice.
Correct.
It's doing voluntary, right?
So agree. Yes. So there are details in that question as well. But our question here seems at the moment it's straightforward, right? We don't know what the children would say, right? We don't know what the children's excuses for violating Shabbos. So there's some uncertainty in terms of that. He doesn't ask. But certainly, for example, we talked about this a little bit when we were doing Rav Chaim Hirschenson, and we talked about in his Malki Bakodesh, who addresses a similar question. And there, he actually starts paying attention to the details of why are people violating Shabbos, and he starts categorizing Jews in different ways based on why they choose to violate Shabbos and how severely they violate Shabbos. We'll see how Rav Chaim Berlin kind of circumscribes all of that, how he circumvents all of that. So sorry, Mark. We'll have to for next time. We'll have to look into that a little bit, see if there's an answer there.
Okay, I was just curious. That wasn't so much.
No, it's a good question.
Because there were numerous tshuvot given to those drafted into those various armies, what they should, the best they should do, blah blah blah. Yes, you should avoid it. Take all pains to get away from it. But once you were in it, there were things you could do to mitigate. But short of that, in the army.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll put it on hold for now.
Okay.
Okay. Good. Any other questions?
Yeah, Yaakov, I just wanted to say that the pasuk that's quoted initially, I find that it's a dichotomy because the first part of the pasuk does not refer to relatives at all. The second part of the pasuk does. It says she'ero. The first part of pasuk is nafsho. Now, if we say that the nefesh of everybody, whole nefesh, who went to Mitzrayim, that includes not just yourself but all your issue, as they say, then I can understand it. Otherwise, it's a stretch in some way.
So that's good. Right. So thank you. So that's a good point, right? So again, if you look carefully at this pasuk initially, and again, this is not our subject per se, but you're right. It says gomel nafsho ish chesed, which ish chesed. So that implies himself, right? Gomel nafsho, but ve'ocher she'ero achzari, and that is she'er is of course relative as it's used in other parts of the Torah, right? So what we see is that so Rashi turns nafsho into she'ero. Right. Yeah. Which, okay, I mean, that has I would say some traditional thought into it. because relatives can be called one,
Yes.
one with themselves. And then Metzudas David does it the exact opposite. He takes she'ero out of the second half of the pasuk and says, "Well, pasuk is talking about the person himself." It says she'ero means his relative, meaning himself. So yes, I think that's a good point. And I guess if we wanted to study the pasuk more carefully, we'd have to start looking through some of the midrashim. There are a number of them, and then obviously there are a bunch of other pirushim. But yeah, it's a good point, though. It's not immediately relevant for our topic.
Yeah, I know. I just.
What does it mean when we say Sheptarani Meyan Shel Zeh in terms of our responsibility at that point?
Okay. So that's a good question. It's a good question, John. Let's not go there at the moment. Okay, we'll come back to it. And we'll see how Rav Chaim Berlin deals with it. It's a good question. That's a good question. Okay, we'll get to it. All right. Okay, so let's go on. So we have one point that we want to bring out from the details, which is here then right before the Chassam Sofer on the sources on the right side. It says, so ve'ein lanu ela kohen shebiyamenu saka kohen agado rabbeinu shach. Okay, so he says we have to pass them like the shach. Dim asara misrael yodim mizem b'par hesed. Okay, so what is public? Public is that if 10 Jews know that somebody is violating Shabbos, that is called public. So therefore, if somebody has their store open on Shabbos, so certainly 10 Jews, presumably if you live in a Jewish area, so presumably 10 Jews will know about it, and therefore it would be a public violation of Shabbos. Okay. Because of a Chassam Sofer. So now we have to look at this Chassam Sofer. So the Chassam Sofer is dealing with this exact question. If someone opens their store on Shabbos, is that called a violation of Shabbos to the point where the person is then has the status of a non-Jew? And he says, without question, the answer is yes. But in fact, there is very much a question. So let's take a look at the Chassam Sofer. So I'm going to move the sources here. So which on the bottom of page 1. Okay, bottom of page 1. Okay, see, inose v'nosein b'chanuso b'chlal machal Shabbos v'yom tov, who is someone who does business in their store, included in the rule of a Shabbos violator. Harehu k'chol machal Shabbos b'yisurim ha'ksuvim b'kra. And so the Chassam Sofer says, without question, that he is, right? So somebody who opens their store is considered a Shabbos violator. And where does he get this from? From the Ramban. Okay, so Ramban says in Parashas Emor, with pasuk Shabboson Zichron Trua Ayin Sham, V'zaloshon Ramban. So this is what the Ramban says about this pasuk, that Rosh Hashanah is called Shabboson, or day of rest, in order to remember the Trua, the blowing of the shofar. Shenistavinu min Torah liyos lanu menucha biyom tov afilu midvarim she'enan malacha. Okay, so this is very important. So the Ramban says there is a biblical requirement to, as it were, rest on Yom Tov, even from things that are not formally malacha. Right? So malacha has very formal categories. There are 39 groups of 39 specific malachos that then turn into kind of groups. And one might say that someone is considered a violator of Shabbos or a violator of Yom Tov if they perform malacha. They do one of these things. If they, plant or plow or bake, one of the 39 malachos that we know about. But what about somebody who opens their store? Somebody who opens their store does not necessarily violate one of the 39 malachos. Right? There is no malacha that says you're not allowed to sell. There's no malacha that says you're not allowed to touch money. There's no malacha that says you're not allowed to make a deal. Right? There is a malacha that you're not allowed to write, but since when do you have to write? You don't necessarily have to. So it's not so clear that somebody who then opens their store should be considered a violator of Shabbos. They didn't violate any one of the categories of work that we associate with Shabbos. Okay, so that's why the Chassam Sofer has to quote this Ramban. The Ramban says, no, there's a biblical requirement of Shabbos that extends beyond the 39 categories of malacha. Okay, so that's what the Ramban says. So back to the second line in Chassam Sofer. Afilu midvarim she'ein malacha, lo yitrach kol hayom not, right? A person should not on Shabbos or Yom Tov work all day, right, to measure how much grain they have or to weigh fruits, and so on and so forth. He has a whole list of things that you might do in business, right? Right, to start moving things around from one place to another, rocks and fruits and whatever it is. And if if you're in an area where that has an eruv, so then you can start loading your animals, and you can have and you could bring produce to the store, right? And so if you're left now on the fifth line, I'm kind of skipping around. The malls can be totally full. The bankers could be open, the storekeepers could be open, everybody could be open. They could be dealing with money and everything. And then the workers can get up to do work, they can carry stuff, they schlep stuff, right? Then everything becomes like a weekday, right? And you can do all of that without formally violating any of the categories of malacha. Okay, now third line from the bottom. Right? There's no malacha here. And that's why the Ramban says the Torah has to tell us that in this case, Yom Tov, but also Shabbos, is called Shabboson. What does that mean? It should be a day of rest and of pause. Below Yom Torach Malacha, and not a day where everyone is busy doing work. Again, not formal categorized work that we would associate with the violation of Shabbos, but work in general. The Rambam, and he says this is what it seems from the Rambam as well. Okay, so the Chassam Sofer now has invoked this Ramban to demonstrate that there's a violation of Shabbos that goes beyond the formal 39 categories of Malacha. Okay? And therefore, he can now condemn people who work in stores, though they haven't violated Shabbos in terms of malachos. He can then condemn them as violators of Shabbos and give them the status of non-Jews. Right? And so, if you go on now to page 2, the top of page 2, the Chassam Sofer continues. Okay, so this is a explicit pasuk in Nehemiah in the 13th chapter, and we're not going to look through, but Nehemiah is in Yerushalayim, and he sees that people are doing business in Yerushalayim on Shabbos. They're not violating Malacha, right? They're not planting, they're not plowing, they're not doing anything like that. They're doing business. And Nehemiah says to the people, "This is a horrible thing that you're doing. This is what caused the destruction of the Beis Mikdash. This is what caused all our problems in the first place. You need to stop." Right? That's what he says. Okay, so clearly, then the Chassam Sofer wants to tell us that somebody who does business on Shabbos, that is considered a violation of Shabbos. So going now to the second paragraph here on page 2, so what we see from this is that is forbidden for anybody who's called a Jew to open their store, or to do any business, or to take things up or put things down from his wagon or his cart, for business on Shabbos or Yom Tov. And if he doesn't listen, and you can't force him, you can't get the government to force him. Now remember, Chassam Sofer is not dealing with America. Chassam Sofer is dealing with Pressburg, which is in Germany, where he was the Rav. So then Jews or the individual communities had some police power. So if you can force the person to keep Shabbos, you force the people to keep Shabbos. But if you can't, such a person has separated themselves from the community of Israel. The Ein Lo Das Klal, it's as if he has no religion at all. Upasol Eidos Shvua, and he is not believed in terms of testimony or in terms of taking an oath in court. Uchol Dabar, or anything else. Shkitaso Asura, person is not allowed shach. And so on. We have to assume that all his food is not kosher, and so on and so forth. Such a person has the status of a non-Jew. Okay, so 1 second. So again, according to Chassam Sofer, somebody who violates Shabbos, even not to the level of Malacha, the 39 categories of Malacha, is still part of a Shabbos violator in name, and therefore does not have the status of a full Jew anymore, but rather has the status of a non-Jew with respect to all this whole list of things. Yeah. Go ahead, talk about it. Go ahead.
in America, if they're right in America, they would be fired from their jobs, right?
Right.
So is that the nefesh?
Okay, so good. So right, so that's so we're not going there at the moment.
It's not
It's a
even
good question.
really violating.
Right.
So it's not the
Right.
rest of it.
Well, it is the right stuff. It's just not performing them a lot. I mean, according to the Ramban. So this question is, how much do you say having to work on Shabbos in order to be able to buy food, for example, right? How much is that really considered, number one, pikuach nefesh, and then number two, because it's not a direct assault on Shabbos in the way that planting and plowing would be, which is a formal category. It's in fact rather a positive commandment of Shabbos rather than the negative commandment of Shabbos, right? So it's Shabbos song. So it's positive commandment rather than negative commandment. Positive commandments are in general less severe than negative commandments. So perhaps you could say you have a little bit more wiggle room, right, with respect to opening a store than you would for a guy who has to plow on Shabbos. So good. So that's a good question. And again, what's one of the things that we see then from because I'm sober not dealing with America, but what we see then from Reb Chaim Berlin is he doesn't ask these questions, and maybe he doesn't know. He's not necessarily as aware as we saw for Reb Chaim Hershenson, who was the rabbi in Hoboken, so he knew what was going on in the United States. He understood what people were going through. Whether Reb Chaim Berlin could feel it in the same way that Reb Hershenson could, presumably not. Whether he even knew about it is also a question, because he just has the piece of paper that has the tshuva in front of him. He doesn't really have anything else. So yeah, but Chaim Hershenson does exactly that. He tries to make these categories in such a way. Yeah, there's one thing somebody plows, but then there's another thing somebody's just working in opening their shop, and maybe that's a little bit better, and we're not going to condemn the person, to be in this status of not a Jew for all these things. Right? So it's a good question.
Right.
Any other questions?
I'm assuming that he could not have commented on. Well, I'm assuming that Rabbi Chaim could not comment on my next comment. But what do you do with businesses that really never shut? In other words, they're global. They're never closed. And you're a partner or an owner. They never close. I mean, you physically could close your physical office,
right?
But constant earnings. There's constant.
No. Okay. The question is you. But the question is you. The issue of getting. You're right. The issue of getting hana, right, of having a gain from business that was done on Shabbos. Okay, that's a whole nother question. We're not dealing with that question.
Businesses that are open, they're always open. They're never going to close. They're constantly going on. You yourself may not physically go in. You yourself not conduct business. Mm-hmm. And the clientele may actually know. Oh, we know Mark, for example. Although it's not my office is not going to be shut, but I don't work on Shabbat. They know this. I mean, after 45 years, then they know me. It's crazy. Right. What? But they're used to that. But having said that, there are plenty of others that clearly operate that way. And there are partnerships composed of both Jewish and non-Jewish partners, and it operates all the time.
Right. Okay. So I mean, that's a good question. So it's not our category. This question of, again, having a non-Jewish partner and keep staying open on Shabbos. What do you do in terms of any money that was earned on Shabbos? Okay, so that's a question.
There were stores and businesses in Europe that you had non-Jewish partners
exactly.
that are open on Shabbos.
And it's the same problem with only chametz and what did you do?
Correct. So there are ways to deal with it. Again, it's not our topic at the moment, but there are ways to deal with it, and you have to go through the details.
His question, his answer really is more of a response to your direct doing something as opposed to your indirect.
Correct. That is what we're dealing with.
Businesses are going to be open. They will function. I mean, again, assuming the person.
But the people that we're talking about here are presumably, new immigrants to America. They have a little shop, or they have a push cart that they go around with. I don't think anybody here owns a conglomerate.
Directly doing it
right. So if you have a chain, I'll make it so you have a chain of gas stations. So mostly they're Indian, but if you have a chain of gas stations, they're open 24/7.
Okay, but that's not what we're talking about here, right? There are no gas stations. We don't know exactly when he wrote this chuppah, but I don't think there are any gas stations. Too many gas stations around.
No, okay.
Just in regard to the question was raised about the Jews who were drafted into the Tsar's army.
Yeah.
I would like to think that if you look to see the tshuvas concerning what to do when you're in a country after you've crossed the date line. Mm-hmm. And they say the day that's suffix Shabbos, so okay, you shouldn't do avos malachos. Mm-hmm. In reality, if you sit down and try to figure out how many avos malachos do you do on any given day, it's very few.
Right.
I mean, okay, so you don't write. That's easy. You don't necessarily get into a car that you're driving. You don't light a match to a cigarette or anything like that. So the issue, again, to differentiate between those who are Mechalel Shabbos, the Farhesia, when it comes to Avos Malachos, so those who just Mechalel Shabbos, but it's not necessarily the Oraisa, maybe the Rabbanon, which is just the script. And also the whole notion and the whole idea of Muktzah, one of the reasons that is given for all the halachos concerning Muktzah is because of those who are what they say Yoshev Kronos. These are people who sit around, they don't have a job, and they smoke, they schmooze, they play cards. So they instituted a lot of the halachos of Muktzah in order to prevent these, because they're just going to go around and push this around and do that and do this and do that. Nothing that's really Chilul Shabbos as such. So I mean, it's two sides. The Muktzah has one of the reasons Muktzah was introduced was to really tighten up the not just Chilul Shabbos, but it's Kavod Shabbos. I mean, there's no cover. You're walking around carrying a heavy rock all day. It's not Shabbosdik.
Right, but that's
wrong.
Correct. But that's the point. But that's the Chassam Sofer's point. The Chassam Sofer's point is you don't have to go back to a Dirabanan. There's a biblical law against it, right, which is much stronger. And once it's right, that's why the Chassam Sofer invokes this Ramban to tell you, no, you're carrying around rocks is not just muksa. Carrying around rocks, for a purpose, is a biblical prohibition that comes from the positive commandment of Shabbos, right, to make Shabbos a day of pause or a day of rest. And so, and because then it's biblical, then we can condemn these Jews who are doing this, to say that they have the status of non-Jews. Right? If it's only a violation on a rabbinic level, that becomes much more problematic. I mean, it's much better, obviously, but it's harder. You're not necessarily going to condemn Jews who violate muktzah to say that they have the status of a non-Jew. That far, probably one would not go.
But do we paskin like the Chassam Sofer?
Reb Chaim Berlin certainly does. But we're not finished yet. We've got a ways to go still. So let's see. All right. So that is the first volley of the Chassam Sofer here, which is to say that it is true then that these children, again, they're not children, but the children of this man are actually, if they would keep their store open, they would actually violate Shabbos in a public fashion in such a way that they would then have the status of non-Jews. So this is a very negative thing. Okay, so going on then to the second part, so like the little bays in the sources, page 2. So Rav Chaim Berlin continues, and he says, "V'achrei kol zeh." So if this is the case, Shem yiftachu habanim schiniosayim b'Shabbos chas v'shalom yunachshavim ka'ovdei avodah zara mamash. So there's no question then that if the children were to open their stores on Shabbos, they would be considered as idol worshippers, as non-Jews. But they haven't quite done this yet. That's not totally clear from the question that they haven't done this yet, but he's assuming that these children have not yet started opening their stores on Shabbos because the father is there. So, okay. So this is the parallel that he then makes. Okay, so not the way John was saying. That's similar to. Well, hold on a second. After bar mitzvah, you say Baruch Shabbat Tzvayim, which maybe alleviates some of the responsibility that the father has with respect to the actions of the child. He goes a different way. Okay, so and he quotes this Gemara in Kiddushin. Basically, the Gemara talks about somebody who's violated the laws of Shemitah. Okay, so every 7 years, you have to allow the land to lie fallow, and the fruit is fruit from the land that does grow is hefker. Anybody could come and take it. And so doing business with the fruit of Shemitah is a negative thing to do. And based on the order of the Psukim, the Gemara learns the punishment of somebody who does that. So basically, the Gemara says that somebody who goes and he starts and does business with the fruit of Shemitah, which should be open to anybody. So someone who does business with them will eventually have to sell his belongings. Then will have to come and sell his land, and then because the person doesn't return from his evil ways, so the person will eventually have to sell himself. And not only will he sell himself, he'll sell himself to a non-Jewish nation, to somebody else, and he'll have to go so far that he may sell himself to an avodah zarah, to an actual idol place of idol worship. Okay, so that he'll have to sell himself such that he'll be a water carrier or what's the right word? An axe, a lumberjack. Right? Thank you, Shra. A lumberjack for a house of avodah zarah. So this is a very terrible thing. But right. So this is a bad thing. Now again, but Rav Chaim Berlindo is very careful, and based on Rashi, he says, it's not that the person who is in this situation, who's gone down this road where he has to sell himself to to a place of avodah zarah, it's not that the person actually worships avodah zarah. It's not that the person is worshiping. It's not that the person is actually worshiping idols. The person is only sold to such a place to work for the idol. Okay, and if that's the case, and this is what the Pesukim say, it is the responsibility of the relatives to redeem the person. Okay, so a person who sells himself, right, is the relative's responsibility to redeem the person. And as long as, the way Rav Chaim Berlin puts it, as long as the person hasn't actually worshipped idols, there's still a hope for such a person, and therefore the relatives have to redeem him. The closer the relatives, the more the responsibility. Okay, and so then he makes the parallel to our case. So let's go in the second paragraph here. Let's start from, I don't know if you can see my cursor again. So here, let's just go from here. So a dayan, right? Eno ovid avodah zarah. Okay, so this person who's now sold himself to a house of idol worship, he has not worshipped the idols, right? But he finds himself in a situation that, due to his job, in order to support himself, because he's undergone this punishment, because he had initially done business with the fruits of Shemitah, so such a person finds himself having to work for a place of avodah zarah in order to support himself, and therefore, aleinu hachova lishtadel sholishtaka biyoser. So it is then incumbent upon us to make sure that he falls no further. Right? He's gone that far, but he hasn't worshipped them. He hasn't actually worshipped idols yet, and it's our responsibility to make sure that he doesn't. Right? And so we can't say he shouldn't be redeemed. That's pasuk, right? But one of his relatives, one of his brothers, has to redeem him from such a situation. And the Torah placed its responsibility of redemption on the relatives. Okay, so that's what happens by avodah zarah, right? This person who's put himself in such a horrible situation. And so that is parallel to what we have here. Right? These children, because father is around, they are not violating Shabbos publicly, right? They are not opening their stores. Even if they may be cooking in their home, they may be baking in their home, they may be violating Shabbos, but they're not violating it publicly. So therefore, they don't have this reduced status as a non-Jew. So if that's the case, if they haven't gone that far that they now violate Shabbos publicly, so then it's the responsibility of the father, right, who is the closest relative, to make sure that they fall no further. And make sure that they won't violate Shabbos publicly, which is an exact parallel. So that would be like worshiping idols. And the person should not throw a rock down on somebody who's fallen, right? So these children, they've fallen in the sense that they no longer believe that Shabbos is important. Maybe they're violating Shabbos at home, right? But to then leave and allow the children to violate Shabbos publicly, that's like throwing a rock on somebody who's fallen down. Rather, it's the responsibility of redemption on the relative. The closer the relative, the more responsibility, which is the father. Al-kain ha-mitzvah alav shalali parid mibanav, and therefore the father has to move in with the kids. Right? And make sure they don't violate Shabbos. To make sure they don't violate Shabbos. Okay, so this is a pretty interesting statement. So Rav Chaim Berlin places this responsibility, which, as John correctly pointed out, right? These are not children anymore. They're children in biological sense, but they're not, age-wise, these are adults. Nonetheless, because he's able to by making this parallel to Avodah Zarah, right? The Rav Chaim Berlin places religious responsibility of the children on the father. And if it means the father has to move in next door to the children and make sure they don't violate Shabbos in public, then he has to move in next door to the children and make sure they don't violate Shabbos public. That's what he says. Okay. Any question on that? Okay. So now, so far, then.
Yeah. I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
How does that relate to children going away to university?
Going to university, that is a slightly different topic. I think that is incumbent upon parents to ensure that if they send their children away to university, they should be in a place that they have the ability to keep Shabbos and various other mitzvahs, all of them preferably. But I have a little bit of a history with this question, but I think that. So it's not quite our topic, Joe. So we'll have to do it at a different time.
Just look online, famous pamphlet.
That's right. You can probably find it online. So.
Sounds like a topic.
It is an interesting topic. It's an important topic. Okay, so far, Rav Chaim Berlin, right, has demonstrated the responsibility of relatives, and then specifically the parents, or in this case the father, to ensure that even their elder children won't fall on a religious level to the point where they would take on the status of non-Jews. Because that's what he's dealt with at the moment. There's one additional issue, which is, what about the father, right? So if the father has to move in, next to the children, so okay, good. So that's the children now are gonna keep Shabbos. But what about the father? What about him? How does this affect his life? So that's what Rav Chaim Berlin turns to then in Gimel. So let me just move the sources here. Okay, so you can see Gimel hopefully. Amnam, what are we talking about? We're talking about a situation where the father himself is a good Jew, right? And he's not a Shabbos violator or a sinner in any way. Even if he's with them in America, but he's willing and he has to sacrifice of himself, of his own religious status. And maybe you'll say, if he's going to be in America, he's not going to have receive religious fulfillment as he may in other places. Maybe he won't have the proper shiurim, right? Maybe he won't be able to learn Torah as well as if he were somewhere else. He's not going to be able to find a good shul to daven in. Big problem in America, right? So if that's what the father has to violate, so fine, and that's what it is, right? So then we would say, so if that's the case, then the father has to sacrifice. He has to say, you can't find a good minyan, you can't find a minyan you like, tough. You can't go to the shiur that you want, tough. It's your responsibility to make sure that your children don't violate Shabbos, and you have to sacrifice of yourself. The more important thing is to worry about his children and not to throw rocks down at someone who's fallen. And of course, hopefully the father has this in mind. He wants to do what's right. Right? And therefore, his goal is to save his sons on a religious level, and therefore, so this is also, of course, a great thing to do, and the person will receive proper reward in the eternal world, as anybody else who performs merit for the public. And it's true. Okay, so the person may have to sacrifice from his own religious stature, as it were, by going and moving in with his children. He'll have to go down in a show that he doesn't like, and he'll have to hear a rabbi he doesn't enjoy hearing. Yeah, he might have to do that, but that is a sacrifice that he's required to make, and he will be properly rewarded at the end of the day. That's if the father is himself not a Shabbos violator. Aval, if we're going down now down to Daled, Avam Aidei Yeshiva Soba America. But if he's going to move to America and he himself is going to start doing things that are not according to the Torah's path, and he's going to start violating Shabbos, let's say, so then we have something else that comes into play, which is that a person is not required to sin in order to make sure that his friend doesn't sin. Okay, so then it becomes a trade-off. So a person doesn't have to sin for somebody else. So that's different than not being able to go hear your favorite rabbi on Shabbos. Right? This is actual sinning. So that a person doesn't have to do. Okay, and this concept also comes up. I think we may have done this on Shavuos night, though I was obviously tired, so I don't remember. I think we may have done this sinning for others. This question comes up. I'll just take a look at the Gemara, which is on the left side there of the column across from part Daled. So here's just one example. Okay, this is something to keep in mind here to make sure we get a minyan. So Rabbi Eliezer walked into shul. They didn't have a minyan. It's good to know that we're not the only ones who have a hard time getting a minyan. Rabbi Eliezer also had a hard time getting a minyan. Okay, so what did he do? He did something that we can't do here. He freed his slave, and therefore, turned him into a good Jew, and done. He's counts now as number 10. Okay, that's a great way to solve the problem. Ariel can work on it. The Hechi Avid Hachi. So how could Rabbi Eliezer do this? V'hamar Rabbi Yehuda kol Shachar Avdo over Basei. Doesn't Rabbi Yehuda say that one is not allowed to free their slaves? That would be a violation of a positive commandment. Shnemar Lolam B'hem Devodu. If we have a pasuk that says they should stay slaves forever, you say no, it's our mitzvah shiny. In order to be able to fulfill a mitzvah, so of course you can free your slave, but the Gemara says mitzvah ba'averihi. But what do you mean it's a mitzvah? If you're not supposed to, you're not supposed to. So what if you get minyan out of it? And so the Gemara says mitzvah d'Rabban shiny. No, this is a mitzvah for lots of people. It's not just Rabbi Eliezer who gains by having a minyan. Everybody there gains by having a minyan. The community gains by having a minyan. Everybody should come to minyan, right? And so it's true that in certain cases you can violate a sin. Right? In certain cases, somebody can sin in order to help others. Okay, mitzvah d'Rabban. But in general, that's not the case. So that's what he ends up saying. So that's what he does here, all in Daled. I want to go on to the next. We don't have huge amounts of time here, so I'll skip a little bit to the rest of this section, and then the Beis Yosef on page 3 deals with this question. We have the famous question that was asked to the Rashba. For those who want to look in the Beis Yosef, it's here, or it's in the Rashba on Zayin Reish Samach Zayin. Here's the Shuvas Rashba, by the way, if you can see me. So there they have a question of a woman being forced to being effectively kidnapped by a Meshumad who's trying to make her convert to Christianity, or maybe it would be Christianity. Can the father violate Shabbos to save her? Okay, that is the question. And so this is that case, right? Can the father sin in order to save his daughter from sinning? The Rashba seems to imply no. Which is a bit surprising, and as you can imagine, that engendered some controversy. Tosfos seems to say yes, and basically, Beis Yosef, Yosef Cairo, and both in Beis Yosef and the Shulchan Aruch passing against this Rashba. But this is an important question: can someone sin in order to save others from sinning? That is the general question. But for the Rav Chaim Berlin, going now to the top of page 4. So in the second paragraph here, he quotes the Rashba just at the end about. So it says, let's go from this second to last line in the Tshuva. Okay, so at the end of the day, he passes like Tosfos, which is that the father can violate Shabbos in order to save his daughter from violating lots of Shabboses because they're trying to force her to convert to Christianity. But a person does not or cannot consistently violate Shabbos in order to save his sons from violating Shabbos publicly, which is what might be the case with the father. And in such a case, then one has to take their own life into account first before the life of one's relatives, even one's sons. So that's where Rav Chaim Berlin ends. So at the end of the day, does the father have to move to America? Does he have to move into the apartment next door? Does he have to go into the shul that he doesn't like? Does he have to not be able to hear the shiurim that he wants in order to save his sons from violating Shabbos publicly? The answer is, without question, yes. However, if by doing so, the father himself will now take a hit, because the father will be forced to violate Shabbos because maybe he would have to work on Shabbos, or whatever, or maybe there's not kosher food, he would have to eat non-kosher food, whatever it is. If he would be placed in a situation where he would consistently sin in order to be able to save his sons from violating Shabbos publicly, so in that type of case, the father's spiritual stature comes first to him, and he would not have to then move in with the sons. So that is the answer of Rav Chaim Berlin. Okay. Any questions on that? Okay, so that's Rav Chaim Berlin, and Rav Chaim Berlin, what he takes again as an assumption is that a public violator of Shabbos is, without question, has the status of a non-Jew. Okay, and therefore, wouldn't count as a minyan, it wouldn't count for a minyan, and wouldn't, you wouldn't be able to eat from his shechita and so on and so forth. But what we'll see now, there's a whole series of poskim who seem to disagree, and especially with respect to America. Okay, especially America. It's known, and we'll see, it's known in Europe that in America there's Shabbos violators, but it's not really their responsibility so much. So let's just take a look at some of them. We'll start with the Melamed HaHoel. So we're here on page 3. The second to last source. So the Melamed HaHoel is Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, who was born in 1843, died in 1921. He was the rector of the Rabbinic Seminary in Berlin. He was the second rector. He took over from Israel Hildesheimer. And the question that he's addressed with is very simple. Can someone who is Machal Shabbos, can someone who violates Shabbos count for a minyan? Okay, that's the question. So, violation of Shabbos wasn't only a problem in America, though it was a problem in America. It was a problem in Germany as well. And so that's the question that Rav David Tzvi Hoffman faces, and he actually tells us a story. So taking a look at the tshuva, says, I remember that there was once a person who was a Shabbos violator. He kept the store open on Shabbos, and he was in Avelis, right? So he had to say Kaddish, and so he wants to daven for the Amud, so he can say Kaddish. And he's a member of our show. Again, they have membership of shuls, they had membership of communities, right? For those who are familiar with the German structure of communities. But so this person, he kept the store open on Shabbos, but he was a member of the Jewish community, Kaladas Yisrael. Okay, that was the name of the community. And he wanted to be the chazan, right? He wanted to lead davening. So here they had a good gabbai, right? Like Aral, since I was good man Aral before. Right? They had a good gabbai like Aral, and the gabbai basically was able to convince this guy, it's not really right. They should have the Amud, and he spoke to him properly, and he was able to convince him, and therefore the person was mochel. The person was willing to give up his rights to daven for the Amud. And everything was good. But what happened? Okay, so this guy, so he was fine, no machlokas, no arguments. Gabbai did a great job, but this guy decided he could just go daven somewhere else. Things haven't changed, right? Now the Gabbai there, right, was also a wonderful person, a good Jew, someone who fears God, right? But But that Gabbai allowed him to be chazan, allowed him down for the Amud without any question. So Rav David Tzvi Hoffman was like surprised, because it's not like we're not talking about some bad guy, we're talking about a good Gabbai, right? So v'chasher sha'alti as a Gabbai lama lo mano. So Rav David Tzvi Hoffman asked him, what was your thought process here? So Amr li shekenu gamkein minhag biyamim kadmonim, the base medrash Shibao said this has always been our custom. that they would allow people who have their stores open on Shabbos to daven for the Amud, to be chazan. And since our rabbis, who were, good rabbis of great stature, since they never said anything against it, the guy who says, "Listen, I'm just the rabbi. The rabbis have always allowed this, and we've allowed this for forever. This has been our custom. So I allowed this guy to daven for the Amud too." Okay, so where does this come from? So Rav David Zvi Hoffman says the extra shesamcha zeh mashakasav gam ken b'shut binyan Sion chadashos. Okay, so he says this comes from the binyan Sion. This comes from Yaakov Etlinger. Okay, who says shemachal Shabbos bizmanenu dechshavim ktsas tinuk shenishba levenanach. That someone who violates Shabbos nowadays, it's not really their fault. It's as if they were raised amongst non-Jews. So this is already a status that the Gemara talks about, someone who was raised amongst non-Jews, and therefore not only is perhaps not knowledgeable about the laws, but just doesn't even comprehend, in a sense, the importance of the laws. And so Rav Yaakov Etlinger, the Binyan Sion, he was really, historically, the first one to make this connection. People who violate Shabbos nowadays, it's not fully their responsibility. They're raised in a context, in an atmosphere that doesn't value it, and therefore they are not considered rebels in the sense that Gemara would imply. Right? Most Jews in Germany at that point do violate Shabbos. And Rav Etlinger says these Jews who violate Shabbos, they're not trying to be rebel. They're not trying to be, not Jews. They're not trying to go against Judaism. They just don't know. Okay, and this is Rav Meshulam Zalman HaKohen, I'm not sure who it is. He told me, M'Shem HaGoen Baal Sholem Meshiv, the name of the Sholem Meshiv, who we've seen in our previous shurim, Shekasav, who writes, Shahanashim America Einam Nifsal Na'idechil Shabbos Shalahem, that Jews in America are certainly not, condemned in this way for violating Shabbos. Because the Jews in America are like Jews who have been captured by non-Jews and raised in a non-Jewish atmosphere, and therefore they lack the responsibility of Shabbos violators, and they would not be considered Ovdei Avodah Zarah. They would not have the status of non-Jews. Okay, so that is the Malam Lahoyel, where, and again, he gets this from Yaakov Etlinger, who's a couple of generations before him. So already in Germany, this has been a problem for a while. But Rav David Zvi Hoffman actually invokes America for us and tells us, okay, in Germany it's one thing, in America it's obviously so. Obviously, the Jews there don't know what's going on. They aren't raised in proper atmosphere. They don't have proper schools. They don't have proper shuls. They don't have good rabbis. Whatever it is, right? And therefore, they are considered tinuk shenishba. They're like non-Jews who've been raised by. They're like Jewish children who've been raised by non-Jews and don't have the same responsibility that a Jew with proper education would. Okay, that's Rav David Zvi Hoffman, but it's not only Rav David Zvi Hoffman, who maybe says like a little bit more modernisha because he's in Germany, right? It's also, we see this in this Kan Aharon. Okay, this Kan Aharon, which is the tshuva on the bottom of page 3, is Rav Aaron Walken, who was born in 1864 and died in 1943. He learned in Volozhin. He learned under Rav Yitzchak Chana Spector, and he was rabbi in Pinsk. And he has the following question. Okay, get this one. A woman comes from America, and she was married. Okay, so she was a Jewish woman, right? She was a Jewish woman. She was married in America. She leaves America. She comes back, and she didn't get a divorce. Instead, her marriage was annulled. Okay, why was her marriage annulled? Her marriage was annulled because her husband did not have the physical capability of relations with her. Okay, they could not consummate the marriage, and therefore she got a psak from the rabbis in America that she does not need a get. The husband, of course, was willing to give a get, was willing to give a divorce, but only if the woman paid a lot of money. So she got a psak from the rabbis in America that she does not need a get because, number one, the husband was unable to consummate the marriage, and number two, because one of the witnesses to the marriage was a Shabbos violator. It was a Mechal Shabbos. And therefore, if one of the witnesses is Mechal Shabbos, so the witness is not a kosher witness, is not an acceptable witness, and therefore it's as if the marriage didn't take place. But the Zakan Aharon is not so sure about that. I have to admit, this is the first time I've ever seen such this logic, but it's very interesting. So he says, okay, okay, good. So let's say it's true, and we know that this person, this witness, was a Shabbos violator and ate not kosher food and all these horrible things. They're not unacceptable witnesses unless they understand that they're not acceptable witnesses. Okay, it's as if it's not their fault, right? Because if you would ask this Jew, right, who is not a bad guy, he just he just violates Shabbos. He eats in restaurants like everybody else does, right? So if you ask, if the question was, would this guy lie? Would this guy testify falsely? Of course, the guy wouldn't do something like that. Right? Of course, he wouldn't. He just doesn't understand that by violating Shabbos, that would put him in a status where he's not an acceptable witness. But of course, he takes that witness responsibility much more seriously than he does Shabbos. Okay. So just because the person violates Shabbos doesn't mean that you're not going to trust him as a witness. Even though we have a Gemara, right? We have a psak in Shulchan Aruch that says that someone who violates Shabbos as if they're like non-Jews, and so how can you believe them to testify? It's not true. It's not true, right? It's not true that somebody who violates Shabbos is going to be accused. They're going to be suspected of lying or of testifying falsely. Okay, and therefore he says. So I'm gonna skip a little bit some of the details. Let's go on to the top of the next page. The top page 4. It says America, right? So therefore again he's pointing to America. Kilkaltam takanasam. The low level that they're in, right? The horrible state of their religion of the Jews in America. That is actually what saves them. Why? Since to them, to the Jews in America, they don't even count Shabbos as important, keeping Shabbos, right? And many people don't even realize that there's an issue. But they're not gonna lie. They're not gonna testify falsely. Therefore, someone who violates Shabbos is not going to be suspect of testifying falsely. As long as they haven't said to him, "You are not a kosher witness because you violate Shabbos." If they told him, then it becomes a different story. But if he hasn't realized, right, then we have no reason to suspect him of lying, and therefore he would be considered a good witness. And therefore, it's the suggestion that the woman does not need a get, a bill of divorce, because the marriage was no good, because one of the witnesses was a Shabbos violator, that falls away. That is not true, according to Rav Walken. Okay, but again, for our purposes, what we see here is that Rav Walken looks at America and he says, right, Kilkaltam takanasam, the horrible religious situation that they're in, that Shabbos has become like nothing to them, right? That actually saves them in terms of their stature as Jews. Okay, any questions on that? No, any question, Mr. Lai? No? Okay, I'll just point out. I have to just point out that this is like not at all obvious, right? It's not at all obvious that the sole role of the witness in a marriage is to then testify, right? It's not. It doesn't seem to be. It doesn't necessarily seem to be the case, right? It seems that the witnesses in the marriage are part of the ritual, and therefore it's irrelevant as to whether the person would lie or not. We're not going to suspect people of lying, just like women. Women can't be witnesses either, but we also suspect them of lying. So this statement by the Kanaron is actually pretty radical, but it does make an interesting point in terms of the status of this. Okay, so that's a little bit of cycle. Okay, so we're good. All right, so let's keep going. We're not done with our posting on Europe yet. The Divrei Malkiel on the top of page 4, Rav Malkiel Tannenbaum was born in 1847.
Excuse me, Yaakov.
Yeah, go ahead, Yaakov.
Women aren't allowed to be witnesses, not because we think that they're chashud.
Correct.
On their ages. When we have kosher and unkosher witnesses, it actually isn't based on whether they're going to lie or not.
Correct.
So I'm not sure I understood what his
Yeah.
point was.
So as I say, this is a radical. It is a pretty radical statement that he's making. Kind of the Violating. He seems to say that at least with respect to marriage, there is the issue is not giving and formalizing, let's say, the marriage process or the marriage ritual. It seems to be based on whether this person can act as a raya, right, as a proof. In terms of their testimony.
Would he
you're
allow,
right. If you
would he
really
allow
believe this,
women
Yaakov,
to be
it
witnesses?
throws our entire, what we've been doing for the past, I don't know, year with respect to Aguna. It throws everything out the window. It becomes very difficult, right? But that's what he says.
But I mean, but literally, would he allow women to be witnesses? Religious women to be witnesses?
Not, right? I assume he wouldn't go that far. But
if he's basing everything on whether they're liars or not, I mean, I can understand non-Jews. You think maybe they're going to, try to screw things up with false testimony, as we've been through. But women, especially women and other children, we don't think they're going to lie. We just. It's just a definition of what's a kosher witness and not.
Correct. I'm not quite sure what's motivating him to come up with this idea, but I agree with you. It's strange. I would say that it's not accepted, and I think that the overwhelming majority of poskim do think that if there is a Shabbos violator signed as a witness, then demonstrates that the marriage is no good. Certainly, Rav Yosef certainly passes that, and then even certainly before him, many of the Achronim rely on that in order to get us out of Zera's problems, in order to get us out of Aguna problems. Right? Moshe talks about this. I mean, this is definitely a radical opinion, and I can't say I've ever seen anyone who holds it.
Who is this groundbreaking posting?
Rav Aaron Walken. Zakan Aaron. I don't actually have one, but if you actually, no, I don't have it here. There's a publishing company now called, I think, Zakan Aaron, and it's descendants of him.
Huh.
Yeah. So if I remember that correctly, don't quote me on that. I have to go look. But it's a good publishing company. They have like all sorts of great stuff that they publish.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, so Rav Kiel Tenenbaum, so the Lamza Rav, so he's Rabbi in Lamza, and what he's addressing, again, look, just born in 1847, died in 1910, relatively young. His question has to do with one of our other favorite topics, machine matzahs. Are you allowed to use machine matzahs on Pesach? Okay, so that's his question. Now he is cool with machine matzahs on Pesach, and let's take a look. Now it's also interesting to know he is writing this. He's writing this to Rav Zechariah Yosef Rosenfeld, who I don't know if anybody remembers. Rav Zechariah Yosef Rosenfeld was the rabbi in St. Louis, and he is the one who put up the first Eruv. Well, I don't know if it's the first Eruv in America, but he put up an Eruv. He and Rav Shalom Jaffe got into a big argument about this Eruv. We talked about this once on this. I definitely remember we talked about this on Shavuos night. You can actually find his book called Tikvas Zechariah on HebrewBooks.org. You can see all about his Eruv. But he also had a question about Mashim Matzahs. Okay, so Rav Malkiel Tenenbaum, right? Zimri Malkiel is actually writing to America. Okay, as opposed to some of the other sources that we've seen here, the Lam Havel, Zakan Aaron, and are not writing to America. He is actually writing to a rabbi in America. Okay, so here's what he says. This is not the whole truth, obviously. So if it's below arich b'zeh, so I'm not gonna go on about this topic. It's obvious to me that there's no problem with machine matzahs. Because it's not like the machine is a robot, right? It's not like the machine does everything. Right? You need people there too. And the people who are there will make sure that the matzahs are made lishma, meaning for the purpose of Pesach. The Habitorah ain't kasuv guf asiyas hamatzos, right? Because even in the Torah, it doesn't say, right, anything about making the matzos. Rak shmiras hamatzos, right? There's no requirement for Jews to make matzah. There's a requirement for Jews to guard the matzah, kisa b'sachim, as we see in the Gemara. And so that's what we need, right? We need somebody to guard the matzahs, in the sense of baking them or imparting upon them the idea of lishma, that they should be made for Pesach. But we don't need Jews to make the matzahs. And certainly based on what you said, okay, here we go. Now let's say you had to hire workers to make the matzah. Right? And most of the workers would have to be Shabbos violators. Okay? So if you have the possibility of the machine versus a public Shabbos violator, so obviously you should choose the machine. Okay? Because public Shabbos violators are suspect for everything religious, as we see in Shulchan Aruch. And compared to non-Jews, and he says, I've written about this before. Tenenbaum deals with this with respect to Yain Nesach, right? With respect to non-Jewish wine. What about somebody who is a public Shabbos violator? Does the person's wine have the status of non-Jewish wine? Okay. Then he puts in a parenthetical comment, and he says, but maybe you can say the Medinas America havi kishogiyim. Maybe it's not true. Maybe it's not true. Everybody said that these people who are public Shabbos violators, that they have the status of non-Jews. Maybe everybody said that's not correct. Because in America, these people are not, these Shabbos violators, they're not doing it on purpose, right? They're accidental violators of Shabbos. Right? They think that this is not such a big deal. Right? Shabbos is not so important. Why do they think that? Because they see lots of Jews violating Shabbos, so they assume that it's not very important. Right? And then there are some Jews, there's a sect of Jews that makes their Shabbos on purpose, like a weekday. And therefore people may not understand, they may not realize the importance of Shabbos, and therefore we might be able to say that public violators of Shabbos in America, right, are shogim. He doesn't use Tinuk Shanishma. He doesn't say that it's as if they're as if they were raised in a non-Jewish atmosphere. He goes even perhaps a step further. He says it's completely accidental. They don't understand the importance of what's going on. Okay, any questions on the Divrei Malkiel? All right, so finally we get to Rabbi Chia Yaakov Weinberg, who also was the head of the Hildesheimer Seminary after Rabbi Tzvi Hoffman. He was born in 1885 and died in 1966. Now, and the question that he's dealing with is burying Shabbos violators, but not even just Shabbos violator, burying people who were cremated in a Jewish cemetery. Okay, so now this paragraph here is actually not from Rabbi Chia Yaakov Weinberg. He's quoting it. It comes from the Munkatcher Rav. Okay, we saw the Munkatcher last week. Rav Chaim Eliezer Spira, 1868 to 1937. And so he's quoting now from the Munkatcher. So the Munkatcher says, Amnam, the Indian Kvurasam. Okay, so about burying Shabbos violators in a Jewish cemetery. Nichsiyanan b'zel l'mashal be'artzos America. Okay, let's take America as an example. Let's find out. Asher nishtaku b'tumas Yisrael chil Shabbos. In America, Jews are violating Shabbos. That's where they are. Right? Rubam kukulam. If most of them, if not all of them. Even Jews who wear tefillin and daven every day, right? This is what happened, right? The Gam b'Shabbos Kodesh, Chiyotze, u'mechalim Shabbos b'Vrasia. People go to shul, right? They daven, and then they go and they violate Shabbos. They go to shul on Shabbos, and they go and they go to work, right? So we know this was true. Right? This is the Munkatcher. Give him credit. He knew what was going on. Okay, so even people wear tefillin and do all these things, they still violate Shabbos. In Cain, ain't truthful lemechtam b'chayim. So what are you going to do, right? They all violate Shabbos. You cannot bury them in a Jewish cemetery. You make them not as if they're not Jews. So somebody who wants to be lenient and to bury them in a Jewish cemetery, not to embarrass them, right? And he wants to compare them as if they say in Shulchan Aruch. Okay, so listen to his parallel. The Kovrei Hameis B'Yom Tov Rishon Ksherim Le'etas. Okay, somebody who buries the dead on the first day of Yom Tov. Okay, so this is this is Yaakov, this is for you, right? So we know with respect to burying the dead, this is one, perhaps the only thing that we see clearly is the difference between the first day of Yom Tov and the second day of Yom Tov. So you're allowed to bury on the second day of Yom Tov. We don't actually do this nowadays, but that does seem to be what the psak is. But of course, the first day of Yom Tov we don't, and that's because of the Yom Tov. The Yom Tov, the second day perhaps has somewhat of a lesser stature than the first day. Again, we don't do this nowadays, but this is certainly something that was done in Europe. But these people kind of got mixed up, right? These people got mixed up, and they buried the dead on the first day of Yom Tov, which is a clear violation. Okay, so you're clearly not allowed to do that. Right, so it's plowing because you're digging, right? So you violate all sorts of things. So in Cain, Avru allowed Deoresa. So these people who bury somebody on the first day of Yom Tov, they violated a Torah prohibition without question. So my time must have a mitzvah, but they don't realize it. They think they're doing a mitzvah. Okay, they think burying the dead is an important mitzvah, no question about it. So these people who are burying the dead on the first day of Yom Tov, they're not trying to violate Yom Tov, God forbid, right? They think they're doing something. They think they're doing a mitzvah. The hachinami hapsaim hafarayim la'elu, right? Sham kitino k'shinishpa. So it's the same thing here. These people who unfortunately are not knowledgeable and don't understand, right? They're like a child who's been raised amongst non-Jews, right? Be'eretz haTmeya, in a impure land, America. Shema yachshavu, because what do they think? They think $1. They think they give $1 to tzedakah, right? They give $1 of what they made on Shabbos. They give that to tzedakah, right? Or they give it to some good cause. They think that kind of like takes care of it, right? They think, they'll work on Shabbos, but it's okay. They'll make a donation to the show, and so everything will be okay. All right, so that's what they think. Okay, he violates everything. Of course, that's nonsense, right? It's Narishkeit. So how can you? But that's what they think. Okay, so they don't realize, they don't understand what they're doing. So amnam lo kol kach chamor nosei avon hamor sham lahakel. Therefore, somebody who is lenient, that's not such a bad thing. Someone who buries someone who is cremated, that he says is a lot worse. Okay, that's a terrible thing to do. That's somebody who paskins, they can bury somebody who was cremated in a non-Jewish cemetery. That's beyond the pale. Okay, now it makes an interesting parallel here. What about somebody who commits suicide? Right? Maybe they drown themselves or whatever it is. Right? So somebody who commits suicide, the halacha in Shulchan Aruch is that you're not allowed to bury them in a Jewish cemetery because you're not allowed to commit suicide. But we changed that. We don't do that anymore. Why? Because they're obviously in so much pain that brings them to this situation where they're committing suicide. So the process that they go through by killing themselves, clearly, right? They realize at the end, right before they die, they realize that maybe they shouldn't have done this, and this is and this was a bad thing. Clearly, they did tshuva at the end of their lives. And it was only because of the great pain that they felt initially that brought them to this state, and therefore, without question, you could bury somebody who commits suicide. You could bury them in a Jewish cemetery. Like America, and maybe this is the situation in America too. If people really, really understood, not just they hear, but they really understood it, they really felt it on the inside, right? That how bad it is to violate Shabbos. So then they would do tshuva, right? But they don't. Right? They haven't internalized it, and that's why they're violating Shabbos. And therefore, somebody who wants to bury non-Jew, to bury someone who violates Shabbos in the Jewish cemetery, so that is not a problem. Okay, so a nice, liberal tshuva from the Mooncatcher, right? Demonstrating his understanding of how things are in America. Okay, so that's Rav Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg quoting Rav Lezer Spira, quoting the Mooncatcher. Okay, so what we see then from these last 1, 2, 3, 4 tshuvos is again a different perspective, perhaps, than Rav Chaim Berlin. Would these rabbis, would these poskim disagree with Rav Chaim Berlin in terms of the need for the father to move in with the sons and make sure they don't violate Shabbos. Obviously, we don't know that. But while Rav Chaim Berlin makes the parallel to Avodah Zarah, right, the children who are now going to violate Shabbos publicly, it's if they're over to Avodah Zarah, we therefore make this parallel to the pasuk that you have to redeem someone who sold themselves to a house of idol worship. Any relative has to do that. So that parallel falls away if you don't believe that somebody who violates Shabbos publicly is considered it has the status of someone who worships idols. So maybe they wouldn't. So we don't know exactly in terms of psak whether these rabbis who now say that that parallel is not true, that someone who violates Shabbos is not considered, does not have the status of a non-Jew. So we don't know, but clearly they're taking a different tack on the entire issue than Rav Chaim Berlin, who takes it as a given that somebody who violates Shabbos publicly has the status of a non-Jew. Okay, so again, this also helps us see what did the European rabbis think about America, right? What were their thoughts? Obviously, they call it Eretz Hatumah. They're not very happy with the way people act. They're, they think that the fact that they're on such a low status, they don't even have responsibility anymore. That's certainly a negative view on on the Jews in America. Obviously, they're all writing in the probably late 1800s, maybe early 1900s. Things have certainly changed a lot since then. But it's interesting to note how the various rabbis then view America and view specifically the situation of violation of Shabbos in America. Okay, any questions?
Yeah.
Not a question, but a quick comment. You said that we rarely see burial on the second day of Yontif, even though it's considered acceptable halakhically. When the Satmar Rebbe's granddaughter died in a fire in Brooklyn, which was, they 50 candles underneath the kitchen counter, 50 people got out of the apartment and she and her child did not. The burial was on the second day of Shavuos, which is one thing, but the 500 cars that drove after them to the cemetery, that's something else.
Right. So agreed, right? So again, I think I've never heard, and I'm pretty sure that we don't bury now on second day of Yontif. Somebody did. Okay.
It was out here it was out here by us. They came out here. We knew, right, Rama?
Wow.
What?
Wow.
Wasn't they buried out here by our cemetery, like in the same area?
Someplace in New Jersey, right?
Wow.
They came out. Yeah.
Right. So driving in cars is more of a problem. That's for sure. Burying is important.
They had the whole bus. What are you talking about?
Right. Maybe they worked it out. Maybe they had a non-Jew drive. I don't know.
But it was an entourage. It was hundreds of cars. It wasn't just the Avela.
Right.
I don't remember. That's right. That's really fascinating.